Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
Let's find out why the Catholic Church near you ought to have a buffalo skull. Hello, Mataki Api. Welcome to Hochoka, here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus. I'm Scott Wooster, today's Hochoka host. We're glad you joined our circle to hear Dr. Damian Costello, a Catholic theologian who specializes in indigenous spiritual traditions and serves as director of postgraduate studies at NATES, an indigenous learning community. Damian is a returning Hochoka guest, and we are very excited to have him join us again to bring fresh perspectives on Catholicism through an indigenous lens. Today we explore the appropriateness of the presence of the buffalo skull in Catholic houses of worship. Damian, welcome to Hochoka.
Thanks for inviting me back, Scott. Absolutely.
And I think it's only appropriate that you and I have a Tatanka skull sitting here between us. And in a later episode, we're also going to talk about sweetgrass, which is braided on our friend here, our relative. So it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
I think it's something that a lot of people don't think about, and we talk about the juxtaposition of the two faiths or two ways of life, or however you want to look at it. But what prompted you to first explore this topic? Why did it come up in the first place?
I had seen buffalo skulls at various Lakota ceremonial sites, an EP, Sundance.
Yeah.
But then I walked into St. Peter's on Standing Rock in Fort Yates, and they had a buffalo skull next to the tabernacle, and I liked it. Right, there was a lot of different Lakota imagery and symbols within the church, but I had never seen a buffalo skull there before, and that got me to think about what does that mean to have that in the church from a Lakota's perspective.
Okay, and it was time for a deep dive, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of dynamics that come into play when you're using in religions or in spirituality, when you're using objects, symbols, prayers from one culture and using it for another. So I know you well enough to know you're aware of that, and that had to have struck you that day as well. These things happen often both within and outside the formal ritual of the Catholic Church, where it gets a little bit fuzzy of what you can use, what you can't use, of course, and probably more so fuzzy with some people more so than others. You've got the spectrum, I would imagine. So we'll call it a liturgical boot camp. What do our listeners need to know to see why this is something that's really you need to carefully sort out for your deep dive?
Well, carefully sort out is a really great way of phrasing it. We have to understand, why are we bringing a symbol into the church, and what does it mean? What's its purpose? Now, first, we should understand that this is a practice that's been going on since the very beginning of the church, right? And some Catholics who get nervous about this may not know that. But the church building itself is a great example. Why do we have a church building? Jesus did not have a church. He did not build a church. He did not go to churches. He went to synagogues, and he went to the temple in Jerusalem. Early Christians adopted the basilica, which was a Greek building that had been adopted by the Romans as a government building, which is a really remarkable thing to do when you think about it. So in the midst of persecution, periodic persecution where the Roman Empire is literally killing members of your church, the church decided, well, this is the form of the building that we're going to use for our liturgy, for our sacred ceremonies. So this has happened from the beginning. So the incorporation of cultural symbols into Catholic liturgy, to Christian liturgy, started from the very beginning and continues today in cultures across the world. What are the important symbols of a people? What do they mean? And how can they serve to aid our worship of the Creator, a worship of Jesus Christ?
Yep. And I think that's pretty easy for me to understand, because for 30 years I've been at St. Joe's, and I've always gone to we're literally in the back of the church, the chapel here, and and those symbols are all over the place in this church. Our kids are used to seeing them when they come into this church. But for you, it was obviously, at least the skull was something new for you when you walked into that church that day at St. Peter's. And so I'm going to have you just explain one word for us in enculturation. Can you just mention what that means?
So enculturation is the idea that Christianity and the Catholic faith doesn't have a culture. It has as many cultures as there are cultural groups in the world. Right? We are familiar with the church being in our own culture, and we just sort of by default assume, like, that's the best place for it. But we should always remind ourselves, well, Jesus didn't speak English, and he didn't even speak Latin. He spoke Aramaic and had a Hebrew form of worship. So enculturation is just the discernment of how a particular people, how their cultural ways of being and knowing should inform how the Catholic faith is embodied within them. And so on 4th of July weekend, you're probably going to sing a patriotic hymn that is both to God, to the Creator, but that uses the language of America to talk about the values that we hold that are compatible with the faith and that the church seeks to promote. It wants us to be good citizens, it wants us to be good neighbors, and it wants us to honor the responsibilities we have within our communities, which include our nation.
So I am assuming that when you walked into that church, you saw the skull, and that's a representation or a symbol. It's an example of enculturation. It's a way of understanding different symbols that are used in the Catholic faith. And like I said, I see them all over here. Talk a little bit, if you would, about incorporating the cultural symbols into the church or the Catholic faith.
So just like the church, like we talked about on the 4th of July, sought to incorporate the positive American values into the church, they're seeking to do the same thing, or we're seeking to do the same thing in a Lakota context. So what does the skull represent? What are the values that it seeks to affirm? The buffalo is very much a Christ figure. It gave its life so that the people could live, and provided everything Lakota people and other nations on the plains to live in a very difficult environment. Nicholas Black Elk talks about how it's the chief of the four-leggeds. And, there's a number of prayers and songs that talk about the power to face the winds. When Black Elk goes up to what is now Black Elk Peak in 1931, he talks about asking the Creator to bless all the children that they may face the wind. Well, that's an allusion to the buffalo, which you probably know, living here on the northern plains, it's 40 degrees below zero out, and the buffalo are facing directly into the wind. That was their spiritual essence.
Yeah. And I use that all the time with the young people that I work with, that when you're facing a problem in life, you face directly into the wind. We do that when we pray. You went a little further in your thinking on this whole issue, I think. And now I'm going to have you draw a distinction. So you've got enculturation, and then you have cultural appropriation. And so can you make a distinction between those two things?
Well, whenever we engage with cultures that aren't our own, there's the risk that we're going to take them and use them for something that's not appropriate.
Yep.
Now, I was not the one who brought the skull into the church, and I think from what I've learned, this was done in partnership with the Lakota community, right? But we want to make sure that we're honoring these symbols and not taking them and doing something with them that people don't want.
Right.
Right? You have to recognize who has the authority to make these kind of decisions. And we see it too often whether it's fashion models on the runway wearing headdresses, or baseball teams who do that, take symbols and use them in a way that isn't honoring, and we have to be careful about that in that discernment process.
Extremely careful. And it's such a fine line between whether that's being used appropriately, it's not being used appropriately. So where did that lead you as you're looking at that and you're trying to decide what that is? I have my own idea of what you might have been thinking at that point. Why did you gain a fresh perspective from this?
Well, it was surprising. I just expected and assumed that this was Lakota, the church sort of affirming Lakota tradition. What I didn't realize is that Lakota tradition was bringing out something to the Catholic tradition that has been largely forgotten.
Yeah.
There's a long history in the Hebrew tradition in the Old Testament and the New Testament that talks about horns as a symbol of power, which we'll get into. And it's based primarily on a now extinct wild ox species that Hebrew people in their Exodus and in Palestine interacted with, called the aurochs.
Okay.
This is a more than 2,000-pound animal, had horns that were 2.5 feet long, each one. And in the Bible, it appears a number of times as sort of one of the ultimate, the epitomes of God's creation, the power of God's creation, and strength.
So you're deep diving on this thing, and you discovered actually quite a bit that existed in the Bible, in the Catholic faith, that had dealt with horns, that dealt with the what did you call it? The aurochs.
The wild ox.
Which again, not many. It's largely forgotten, right? And not too many people know much about that. I mean, let's just say you're probably leading the charge here with knowledge about this particular subject, but it's so fascinating of how that ties in. That piece of it ties in continents apart and world views apart and all those kinds of things. So what did you find out as you dug deeper into the Old Testament?
Well, that the wild ox and the horn are symbols of God, and ceremony plays an enormous role in this. So when Israel is escaping Egypt, right, it's on its journey. It's 40 years in the desert, and it's coming into the Promised Land. A king summons a holy man. His name is Balaam. And a lot of people remember the story, Balaam's donkey. This donkey tries to, prevent him from going because Balaam's not listening to God in the appropriate way. But he finally gets there, and the king says, all right, Balaam, I want you to curse these people who are a threat to me. And so Balaam has 4 different ceremonies on 4 different mountains, which are the sacrifice of 7 bulls and 7 rams, horned animals. Very common in the Middle East at this time. Each time the Creator speaks to Balaam and says, do not curse these people. They're powerful. I'm leading them with the horns of the mighty ox. So the Creator is telling Balaam, after this ceremony, which, uses the wild ox, that I am like the wild ox. I have this power, and I am leading these people. And this translates into Hebrew ceremony, the ceremony of Israel. Now, I think I was basically familiar with this, but the whole liturgical life and ceremony of Israel was based on the sacrifice of animals.
Right.
The temple, first it was the traveling Ark of the Covenant, and then the temple in Jerusalem. Every day, animals were sacrificed. Every day, twice a day, incense was sacrificed on the altar of incense. And at the corners of that altar and the altar of sacrifice were horns on the altar. This was an incredibly important part of the faith that Jesus grew up in. And, archaeologically, they have studies that show that animals from as far as 200 miles would be brought to Jerusalem to be sacrificed. If you were anybody of importance, that was one thing that you would do with your life, is you would bring a bull or a ram to be sacrificed in Jerusalem.
Obviously, the horns on the, not an altar, a sacrificial table. Am I reading that right? But why would they? There was a purpose for it, right? Why would they lay them out in a certain configuration or whatever? Why would that happen? I mean, were you able to go there?
Horns were considered to be the epitome of power, the strongest animal and the strongest part of the animal. Another important reason why the horns were on the altar is that they were a symbol of royal and messianic power, of leadership. And this is something that we've also forgotten, but in the old times, they would anoint kings by pouring oil on them from a horn. And so there's the great story of David being anointed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
The last child who was even ignored was brought forward, and they poured oil on his head, and the Spirit rushed upon him. Which, putting oil in a horn is very similar to Lakota tradition, because in Lakota tradition, they have the medicine horn, where herbs, sacred healing herbs, were stored in buffalo horns and kept there because of the power of the horn and the power of the medicine.
So we've got, I understand the symbol of the horns as strength, and I understand them as something for utility, right? I get the strength, the inherent strength in the buffalo horn, and I get them as a symbol of strength. How do they become a symbol of faith or spirituality? Where does that come into play?
So in the Hebrew context, and I think this is probably true of a lot of indigenous contexts, spirituality and strength were basically the same, right? You know, that great concept of wakan, that holy sacred power. You know, we think, when we hear the word sacred or holy in a modern context, we think of sort of an otherworldly power, like take us out of this place, and it has this sense of purity, and we don't relate it well to our everyday context. Sacred power in indigenous context is the strength to flourish in this life right now. And so royal figures and then the Messiah was going to have the greatest strength so that the people could flourish on the land and live in harmony. So it became associated with, you know, this strength to flourish with spiritual power that we later lost. This gets connected with Jesus in the New Testament, where Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, was called to sacrifice incense on the horned altar, the altar of incense. And he does. The angel appears to him. And after John is born, he has this long prayer, which is known as the Benedictus. But he talks about God raising up a mighty horn of salvation, the messianic image. So just as David was anointed with the horn of oil, Christ was the anointed one. That's one thing, you know, you could have asked me a couple months ago, hey, why do you call yourself Christians? And I would say, oh, followers of Christ. Okay, what does Christ mean? I don't know. Holy guy, God's son. Christ means the anointed one. So literally means, if we were going to spell this out in sort of a Lakota way, literal translation, he who has been anointed with the horn of oil. That's what Christ means.
Right.
And so if you call yourself a Christian, you are literally alluding back to something like the buffalo skull.
Right. You've talked a little bit about what the horns of the buffalo mean in relation to Jesus' death. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, on the cross, I think most people have heard Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some people take that out of context and think like, oh, Jesus is despairing. But actually, he's quoting the very beginning of Psalm 22. Long psalm, very beautiful. The first half sort of recounts all the struggles that the Messiah is undergoing. The wild dogs are after me. I'm being trampled. I am broken. I'm a worm. I am not a man. And then the second half shifts to Thanksgiving, where the narrator is praising God for his help, for saving him. And in the middle, there's a passage that's often missed. It's translated, I think, wrong. The psalmist says, you have answered me from the horns of the wild ox. We don't have any context for this, modern people particularly, and so it's often translated, you saved me from the horns of the wild ox. But without that, there's no explanation why the psalm changes. What has God done for the person in distress? He's actually answered the person, and it's from the wild ox, which goes back to Balaam and his vision of God having the mighty horns of the wild ox. And so I think that is sort of at the fulcrum of the whole story of Christ, the horns. And this is occurring at the temple, just outside where the animals were sacrificed, where the altar of incense was, and where Zacharias offered up his incense at the horn of the altars.
Okay. And so you've deep dove into the Catholic tradition to find these nuggets, right? And even in some forgotten parts or things that have been lost in translation, would you say? So how does that present itself in the Lakota tradition?
Well, that's what I think, what surprised me, and I think what the really important part of enculturation is, and what Lakota and all the different cultures of the world bring to the Catholic faith. What it should do, it's not just a sort of paternalistic pat on the head, like, okay, we're not too sure, but I guess we'll let you bring your symbols in, and maybe we're uncomfortable with that. What this buffalo skull did for me is to show me a whole window into the faith that I had never seen before, but that actually makes more sense of what I've been taught as a kid. Now, Scott, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of people talking about the power of the Eucharist, power of the Eucharist, which I understand and I've experienced, but I've never heard anybody say, what is that power like? They never describe it. And I think from this tradition, we can say it is like the power of the wild ox, or what we're more familiar with, it's like the power of the buffalo. If you've experienced that in person, whether alive or even in the presence of a skull, you know there's a tangible power there. And so for somebody to say, within the Bible, God has the horns of the mighty ox, and that is the source of his power that brought his people out of slavery, out of Egypt. And that's where he answered Jesus on the cross and showed Jesus, you are the horn of salvation. You are the wild ox of salvation. And you followers, you are the people who have had the oil from the mighty horn of salvation poured on your head. That makes a whole lot more sense to me. That's the kind of power I want in my life. And that's why we go to Sundance, because we know it's there too.
And that's why it's important to include all faiths and to in the symbols and culturation, all of that. And it worked for you, and it can work for others, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you so much for explaining that for us, for bringing your wisdom, your knowledge to Ho-Choka, to us here in the studio. Thank you to our viewers for joining us here today in Ho-Choka at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native American education today. Until next time, stay centered.